the year 980, a member of the English royal family wrote a history of England for his cousin in Germany, looking back on the great events of their times. "My dearest Matilda," he wrote, "here you'll find the story of our family. A tale of so many wars and killings of men, a shipwreck of navies on the waves of the ocean. Now your uncle was King Aethelstan. In his time the barbarian forces were overcome on all sides, and England emerged as the victor. The fields of Britain became one. There was peace everywhere, and abundance of all things. He was a mighty king, worthy of high honor." Among all the great rulers of British history, Aethelstan today is the forgotten man. But in his time, a continental poet thought him an English Charlemagne. His nicknames in Scandinavia were the faith-strong and the victorious. To the Irish, he was the pillar of the West. To the Welsh, the king of kings. To the Scots, simply a bastard. But Aethelstan will turn the dream of Alfred the Great into reality. A kingdom of all the English. This is the tale of how the Kingdom of England was created in the Viking Age by the most remarkable family in British history. And the third great figure in this story is Aethelstan. But the most surprising thing about him is that when we look for contemporary accounts, there's almost nothing. We've come back to the source we followed through this tale, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Chronicle tells how King Alfred resisted the Vikings and created a single kingdom of the old rivals, Wessex and Mercia, a kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. It tells how his son and daughter expanded the kingdom and conquered the Viking Midlands and East Anglia. But when it comes to Aethelstan, there's a surprise. Aethelstan's the most powerful ruler that Britain has seen since the Romans, and you would have expected the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to wax lyrical about these great deeds of the dynasty, the grandson, after all, of Alfred the Great. But something very strange happens in this manuscript. No account is written of the reign of Aethelstan. Only 16 years after Aethelstan's death was a new booklet inserted, which gives us 4 facts: his accession, his death, and his wars. Somebody in Winchester clearly didn't see Aethelstan as being quite the legitimate successor to the throne of the West Saxons. To find out why, we need to go back to Winchester, the capital of Wessex, in the last days of Alfred's life. At that time, Aethelstan was Alfred's only grandson, and just before he died, Alfred knighted him with the symbols of kingship. Seeing the boy's graceful manners and handsome looks, Alfred affectionately embraced him and gave him a Saxon sword, a jewelled scabbard, belt and cloak, in omen of a kingdom. A poem was presented to the little boy, punning on his name. "Prince, you're called Aethelstan, noble stone. Take this as a happy omen for your life. You will be a royal rock, fighting fearsome demons. But take the holy path of learning too, and if peace comes, I pray that you may seek and God may grant the promise of your noble name." But in the Middle Ages, a year was a long time in politics. After Alfred's death, Aethelstan's father, King Edward, married and had other sons by his queen. And Aethelstan was sent to be brought up by his aunt, Aethelflaed, in Mercia.
Aethelstan was brought up at that Mercian court, and his formative years must have been passed in her orbit. She would be telling him the stories about her father and about her education at his court. I think it's impossible to describe Aethelstan's personality without looking at Alfred's input into it.
So Aethelstan grew up in Mercia. He was educated in Latin letters. He trained to fight and hunt with the Mercian thanes in the rolling hills of the Forest of Dean. As a young man, he must have fought in his aunt's campaigns in the Danelaw, where he earned a name for courage and nerve. But as he grew up in Mercia, did Aethelstan still think, despite his father's remarriage, that he was the true heir to the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons?
Remember the care with which Alfred the Great had tried to ensure that the succession would pass down peacefully through his descendants. But look at this. There's Alfred's son Edward. And Edward had at least 14 children by 3 different wives, 2 of whom were anointed queens. Here's the sons. His heir, the King of Wessex, Alfred, who's in his 20s. The next heir, Eadwin, his brother, also in his 20s. And here in the middle, Aethelstan. He's the oldest. He's the son of a lesser consort. It says here in French at the side that Aethelstan was warlike and courageous and greatly feared and the most handsome man that ever lived. The stage was set for a typical medieval succession crisis.
And that's exactly what happened. After Aethelflaed's death, King Edward marched into Mercia, but in 924 the Mercians revolted against him, and on the campaign Edward died near Chester. And then only days later, so did his chosen heir, Aethelstan's half-brother Alfred. And now the Mercians chose Aethelstan as their king.
Here in Winchester, it must have seemed it was one piece of bad news after another. The Mercians are in revolt in the northwest. The king has died, suppressing rebellion. His heir apparent in Wessex, King Alfred, doesn't even get back home. He dies mysteriously 16 days later. Rumours swirling of plots and intrigue, murder maybe. And then to cap it all,
the Mercians have elected Aethelstan not as their lord, but as their king. At that point in the story, it must have seemed that the joint kingdom of Wessex and Mercia, created by Alfred the Great, was about to be torn apart. But to save the family project, Aethelstan now offered a deal. He wouldn't marry or have heirs. He'd be a kind of caretaker king.
He's not known ever to have married. There was a certain way of avoiding tensions in royal dynasties. In some adult men renouncing family and heirs in order to make way for younger brothers or nephews. The Franks occasionally tried this. Kings in Spain in this period also tried this. It was an option.
But it still took a year of infighting before he was accepted in Wessex. And even then, there was a plot to blind him before he was crowned. No wonder then that he was strategic in his choice of coronation place. He was crowned not in Wessex or in Mercia, but on the border between the two at Kingston-on-Thames. Kingston had the only bridge across the Thames, other than London Bridge, up until about 1750, I think. And so presumably the King of Wessex comes to the edges of his kingdom, so that he can then bring his lords over from Mercia and begin joining together all that national story.
Yeah. If you're bidding to be king of all the English, then a place on the boundary between the two key kingdoms, the West Saxons and the Mercians, would be ideal. Yeah.
He was crowned here on the 4th of September 925. It was the first English coronation. Tradition said on a great wooden platform set up in the marketplace in front of Kingston Church. And if you've been here that day, what you would have seen was a series of carefully orchestrated ritual tableaus of dramatic scenes in which the Archbishop and the bishops anointed him, gave him the sword of justice, the ring and the rod and the scepter, and then on his head they put the crown. And Aethelstan's the first British monarch in our history to be portrayed wearing a crown. And he was crowned in the name of the two peoples, the West Saxons and the Mercians. For if one kingdom of England was ever to emerge, it couldn't happen without the two of them.
When the ceremonies were over here at Kingston, there was a great coronation banquet for all the court, overflowing with fine food and wine. But before the king left the church, he performed one last intimate ritual. In front of the altar, he freed a slave.
Aethelstan kungi freude eadelm for att det fasta hith arrest kung was. Und ich an som bernan sas ilkan, sas ich stam fader an.
This is a book which Aethelstan seems to have had with him at the time of his coronation. It's obviously a book of great importance to him, and he's used it to record this act of his. It's a good act for a king to perform at the time of his coronation. The highest and the lowest in the land associated with the same inscription. It's a nice way to put it, yes. He's keen to get his credit for this, and it's obviously an act which will benefit Aethelstan as much as it will benefit the person he is freeing.
So he'd won the crown. He was 30 years old, and as he believed, called by God. But he's also a politician, a man with nerve. But he still faced many threats. Beyond the Humber, Northumbria was ruled by a powerful Viking dynasty whose empire stretched across the Irish Sea to Dublin on the Western Isles. Wary of Aethelstan's warlike reputation, they immediately sent ambassadors. And in New Year 926, he met them at the old Mercian royal centre of Tamworth. Here, in a great ceremony, he married his sister to Sihtric, the pagan Viking king of Northumbria.
Sihtric accepted baptism as part of the deal, with Aethelstan as his sponsor, his godparent. Lots of later legends here in Tamworth about this tale, and those beautiful windows up there by William Morris give you the story. There's Aethelstan on the left, giving away his sister. There she is, Edith, in white, receiving a ring from her rather handsome Viking husband-to-be, not the grizzled, one-eyed veteran of history. And next to them, the Bishop of Lichfield, Elder, a central figure in Aethelstan's regime. It's a fascinating moment in the story of Viking Age England. The granddaughter of the most Christian king, Alfred the Great, is marrying the grandson of Ivar the Boneless, the bloodthirsty Viking who died on campaign in Repton 50 years before and was buried with human sacrifice at the graveside. But Aethelstan's accepting the facts on the ground. Scandinavian England is here to stay, and on this spot, Sihtric is honoured as a descendant of the royal line of the race of the Danes.
So Aethelstan had begun his long-term plan, after 60 years of war, to bring peace to the Isles of Britain. Back in Winchester, like a new president, he surrounds himself with his own men and a think tank from all over Europe.
And it's the people around Aethelstan at this moment that are really interesting. Werulf, the priest, famous Mercian scholar who was part of Alfred the Great's translation team. Walter, Gundlaf and Hildwyn are German names. Dubliter is an Irish abbot and scholar. Petrus, a Frankish learned man and poet. This is Aethelstan's courtly circle, his intellectual bodyguard around him in the potentially hostile atmosphere of Winchester.
But looking over his shoulder at that moment is his father's next chosen heir, Prince Edwin.
Eadwin Clyton, Prince Atheling Edwin, his half-brother. If Aethelstan had agreed not to marry and not to beget heirs in becoming king, then this is the heir apparent. And Edwin will play a very dramatic role in the story that follows.
For the moment, Aethelstan's rule was secure. But the next year, 927, the politics of Britain changed with dramatic speed.
Herra Theodon fyrna ljóman og norðdali þar í lyfte. Sihtric kval, Aethelstan kuning fengt og Northumbra rike. Ealetha kuninges on þessum Ílandi waren, hei vilde.
Aethelstan, now armed for war across the whole of Britain, wrote his court poet Petrus, spearheaded by his armour-bearing thanes. Sidrich of Northumbria had rejected the king's sister and renounced Christianity, but then died. And when his kinsmen came over from Dublin to claim their kingdom, Aethelstan invaded Northumbria and drove them out. And now he sends ambassadors to the kings of the Scots and the Strathclyde Welsh, calling them to a peace conference in Cumbria.
This is the Emont Bridge. This is where Aethelstan met Constantine, the king of the Scots, Owain, the king of the Strathclyde Welsh and the Cumbrians, and Ealdred and Uchtred, the lords of Bamborough, the Anglo-Saxon rulers of northern Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions kings of Wales too, the king of Gwent and Hywaldar of Difford, the future lawgiver. Maybe they came here too.
Here the northern kings acknowledged Aethelstan as the supreme king of Britain. It was a turning point in British history. Guided by God-given dreams, as well as by realpolitik, Aethelstan was determined that this would be a Christian empire. Before the kings parted, they went to a little village called Dacre.
So why did Aethelstan bring the kings of Britain out to this lonely valley above Oswater? Well, the answer is that. Dacre was an Anglo-Saxon monastery from the 7th century. It's mentioned by Bede. St. Cuthbert was supposed to have performed one of his miracles here. So they came here because it was a sacred place. And it was on this spot that they would have performed their solemn oath against idolatry, Diefolgeld, and made their pact of peace.
Writing back to the royal family in Winchester, his court poet was jubilant. "Let her wing your way back to the palace. King Aethelstan lives, glorious through his deeds. This England is now complete." So Aethelstan had power, but what he still wanted was legitimacy. That summer, 927, he sends an embassy to Rome with his Archbishop Wulfhelm and the famous Welsh king Hywaldar. The new Archbishop was to receive his spiritual authority from the Pope himself. And the Pope would give his blessing to Aethelstan's Christian empire. The king is fired up now by his own sense of history, his awareness that he is guiding great events. The ancient Roman historians had spoken of a tripartite world, Europe, Africa and Asia, with Britain beyond the edge. Now Aethelstan would claim to rule the world of Britain, a Christian empire with the authority of St. Peter.
Aethelstan's pan-British embassy to Rome will have spent 2 or 3 months here and then begun the return journey in the new year of 928. And over the next 6 years,
a revolution will take place in English government as far-reaching, if not more so, than the Angevins and the Tudors. This is the moment for Aethelstan's visionary kingdom of all the English. When the embassy returned, Aethelstan held a great Easter council in Exeter. The sacred flame, he said, has blown across the tripartite world. In this third year of my reign, which there is now no doubt is gifted by God. And so he began his project with laws on charity and a ferocious clampdown on crime. And he's already moving fast. It's as if he thought he didn't have much time and was desperate to turn his ideas into reality. No biography has survived for him as it has for Alfred, so his story has to be pieced together from fragments, inscriptions, burned manuscripts. And one key aspect of his revolution in government is revealed in an unlikely source, the king's land grants.
Although it's only a land document, I say only, but it gives a vision of his kingdom at that moment, doesn't it? Yes, I think that the point about these royal diplomas is that any one of these on its own is interesting up to a point. From a historian's point of view, the interest of these documents is completely transformed when you put them all together. Because these charters are dated, because they're localized, you can begin to see how the king moves from one part of the country to another. So yes, these are the documents that represent the first flush of enthusiasm for this new kingdom of the English.
And in this new kingdom, the king demanded control and wanted feedback. So he travelled constantly, holding regular gatherings of local and national leaders. One of these was held in November 931 at Lifton in Devon.
Regni verro gratis mihi commissi septimo in villa omnibus notissima, quae Leuftun num cupetur. Episcopis, abatibus, ducibus, patriae procuratoribus, regia dapsilatate ovantibus.
There must be hundreds or so people named in this charter. One imagines certainly that there would have been 200, 300, 400 people present at the meeting.
Maybe thousands?
Even more, yes. I mean, certainly the bishops are certainly not going to be travelling on their own.
So many hundreds of people needed to be fed and temporarily housed, from support staff to the king himself.
We can begin here with Ego Aethelstanus, so you have Aethelstan, King of Britain, he's called there. Then you have Ego Wulfhelm, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Here in the far west of Devon were Viking earls from the Danelaw, feasting with the kings of Wales.
And then, most interestingly, you have Ego Howell Subregulus, Welsh sub-king. So the Welsh kings have come down to Lifton in Devon in November and are acknowledging Aethelstan as the supreme king of Britain then, Simon. That is certainly the impression that this charter of Aethelstan is creating. Yes, as I said, whether the Welsh see it quite the way is another matter.
The world had changed. A whole new agenda was on offer, which was this notion of consensus, of collaboration, of assemblies as the place where you shape policy together. It had to be happening in assemblies. beyond the court, in the shires, in the hundreds. And in these places, landowners and royal agents communed with each other and came to share an ideology which bound the king and his people together as divinely approved.
So in the mundane record of the king's journeys, you can glimpse the growth of English government and even the origins of Parliament.
Lawmaking is one of the most important aspects of assembly functions. Aethelstan makes laws on a large scale.
That's fantastic.
There's clearly also a good deal of give and take, general discussion between the king and his great men. There's one instance in one of Aethelstan's law codes where he says there are complaints about disorder, and he says, my councillors have said that I have suffered this too long. And there's clearly a sense there of give and take. The councillors putting up a point, making a complaint, and the king responding.
He apologises for the state of the nation. My councillors say I've borne it too long. But then he sends a messenger, following on the latest lawmaking session.
Se kung gwathto his witan, dat himto hreulich thuchte dat man swa jungne man kwelde, och se efter swa lytlan swa hi axot havde dat man jahwardide. Kwatha dat him thuchten, on samse hit wisrade dat man, nanne hingren man ne slojesone 15 winteren man.
We all grew up with the idea that Simon de Montfort is the founder of the English Parliament, but you're suggesting we should look much further back in time. Legislation, political discussion, consensual politics, the sort of thing that goes on in 13th century politics. And you can trace, I think, a clear line through, in terms of the history of large assemblies, straight through from Aethelstan to the 13th century. Of course, a lot changes, but there is a clear line of continuity.
And to see how it all worked at grassroots, we've come to a borough built by Alfred the Great, and especially favoured by Aethelstan.
We're just outside the little town of Malmesbury in Wiltshire, on the northern edge of the West Saxon kingdom in Anglo-Saxon times. Just over the Avon into Gloucestershire, that's Mercia. And from at least as far back as the 14th century, the townsfolk here have believed that these fields were given to the town by King Aethelstan. And believe it or not, even today, these fields, known as the King's Heath, are administered by King Aethelstan's court.
To help enforce his laws, all freemen had to swear a solemn oath of loyalty to him.
All persons come forward and do your business in a peaceful manner.
Warden and Freeman of Malmesbury, King Aethelstan's feast day court was held in the Old Courthouse on Tuesday the 12th of June 2012 before M. Westmacott, Warden, O. Pike, N.O.J. Pike.
To break your oath was treason to the king.
The Warden's oath. You shall swear that you will well and truly execute the office of Warden of this corporation. You shall maintain, support and uphold all the rights, liberties, immunities, privileges and franchises of the corporation.
So Aethelstan's subjects were bound by the sworn oath in village tithings and the courts of hundred and shire.
So it's wonderful seeing these ancient English traditions still in action, isn't it, Ava?
The warden and free purchasers of Malmesbury have a direct link to Aethelstan via the 500 acres that he gave us in recognition of our assistance in his fight with the Danes. So there's the direct link. So you can't get away from that.
The king, in a nutshell, was creating an allegiance to his person, but most of all to his law, a key idea in English history. Aethelstan also fixed England's physical frontiers. Across the Tamar, the Cornish too now became part of England for the first time. And 40 years on from Alfred's Viking wars, Aethelstan overhauls his defensive network of boroughs. He closes some down and turns others into centres of trade and civic life. In Exeter, he restored the Roman walls, laid out streets and housing plots, encouraging merchants to settle. But markets need outlets. Aethelstan granted to Exeter the old Roman port on the river Exe, a place, as he put it, known to the locals as Toppesham.
Morning! Salmon fishermen. Those boats are for salmon fishery. Grant of Topsham to Exeter in the 10th century mentions these fisheries. Still doing it.
Topsham would grow rich on Exeter's trade. Wool from Devon, tin and silver from Cornwall. So trade came with the revival of the English town. In Aethelstan's time, it was said, the standard of living started to rise. There was plenty in the shops. But markets must have money.
Und requiredon that our munitia over Arthas kynge somewhere, und namon munitia boton on port. Und jisse munitora full wurde, sleaman of the hond.
The only authority for the currency now was the king, who took a cut of the profits of each mint. By the end of the 10th century, nowhere in southern England was more than 15 miles from a mint. The English people were getting used to living in a money economy.
We have here a very nice example from Chester. In this particular case, we have the name of the king surrounding a cross on one face, and we have him being called Aethelstan Rex to Aethelstan, the king of all Britain.
The king of all Britain.
Yes. And then on this other coin, which is from Winchester, we see again this same title, Aethelstan Rex to BR, king of Tutis Britanniae, all Britain. Completely the other side of the kingdom, but yet using the exact same title, and of course the same title that is used in his charters and in certain other documents. The fact that we see it coming through in both types of source really does indicate that someone at the top of the food chain is issuing a command that it's got to change, that we've all got to start singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of what we're calling the king.
So Aethelstan was a man in a hurry. His first 6 years saw great practical achievements, but culture and learning would also play a key role in nation building. His grandfather Alfred had begun the revival of education, and Aethelstan took it to the next level.
You can't put together a collection like this for any other Anglo-Saxon king. He obviously liked books, and he saw books as a useful tool for him to make his connections and to establish his networks and so on.
And in his books you can see too how learning was to be a tool of kingship.
Well, here you have an extraordinary inscription indicating that this gospel book was given by King Aethelstan to the Church of Canterbury.
Very fancy titles here. Aethelstan Anglorum Basileus et Curaculus.
This is all fancy words used in order to express kingship. Aethelstan, king of the English and ruler of the whole of Britain. He's king not only of the English but also of the whole of Britain, which is an extraordinary claim.
When Aethelstan was a boy, his grandfather had urged him to follow the path of learning. And his own book of Psalms hints at his personal interests, with its added paintings, its religious calendar, and its private prayers.
The end, perhaps most surprisingly, series of texts in Greek, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and so on. You can get a real sense of the king is an intellectual, dare one say.
One writer he especially admired was the 7th century saint Aldhelm, to whom it was said Aethelstan devoted himself body and soul. And this manuscript of Aldhelm was written by one of the king's scribes.
What you're looking at is 10th century scholarship. Almost every word, every phrase is being glossed, i.e. explained and commented on. And through this manuscript there are thousands of these.
And perhaps the choice of text also tells us about the unmarried king himself. Its message that self-control, purity of mind, chastity, is a victory for a man, as great as victory in battle. But even a warrior hero must fight his inner demons. The king spent Christmas 932 at Amesbury in Wiltshire. And then, out of the blue, comes this. In this year 933, King Aethelstan ordered his brother Edwin to be drowned at sea. Many later legends grew up about the drowning of Prince Edwin. It was said that Aethelstan had been turned against his brother by a wicked cupbearer, that the councillors of England had tried Edwin in London and drowned him off London Bridge, and even better, that Aethelstan had deliberately and cruelly had Edwin set afloat in the middle of the sea in a rotten boat with no oars. What we know is that Edwin was buried at Saint-Martin in Flanders, and there a chronicler told how King Edwin had drowned at sea, fleeing across the Channel after upheavals in his kingdom. Later legends said that Edwin had been unjustly accused of rebellion, that afterwards, weighed down by guilt, Aethelstan did public penance.
Oh, that's magnificent, isn't it?
It is beautiful.
Oh.
And that he founded a church where prayers would be offered for his brother's soul and his own sins.
And the foundation of all of this obviously was the original church that burnt down, founded by Aethelstan here. So King Aethelstan in 934 founded the church here, which was then called Middleton, as a penance for the death of his brother, who he believed was plotting against him. And he felt so guilty about it. The legend is that he actually built the church here on this site. And as we can see in the paintings, very much that he's offering the church to the abbot. Possibly Aethelstan had behaved in ways perhaps which he then regretted.
Strangely enough, in the Irish law codes, there is a punishment of being set to sea in a boat with no oars. It's actually a legal punishment for homicide of brothers. Amazingly,
yes,
and it's obviously a way in which you don't want to have the blood on your hands of actually executing somebody.
Yes, almost like a way.
So you set them to sea, and if God allows them to come back to land, then fine. If not, it's done with. You know, so there's an eerie shadow behind the tale, isn't there? Really?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the succession crisis after his father's death had come back to haunt him. Aethelstan's hard-won authority had been shaken. The next spring, Constantine, king of the Scots, renounced his allegiance. And Aethelstan now raised a great army to punish Constantine and bring him back into the fold. 934. Hier for Aethelstan Koning in on Scotland. From Winchester on the 28th of May, they rode to Nottingham and then up into Northumbria. Either ye met landherre with a land army, ye met shipherre with a navy. On the 1st of July, as the English fleet moved up the east coast, the land army stopped at Chesterner Street on the River Wear, the shrine of St. Cuthbert.
Aethelstan came here with his grand army from all over Britain. He came into the little church on this spot, and the priests opened St. Cuthbert's coffin so the king could actually touch the preserved body and wrap it in beautiful embroideries that he'd brought with him. Aethelstan's grandfather Alfred had had a vision of St. Cuthbert in his moment of direst danger in the marshes of Somerset. Cuthbert had prophesied that Alfred's descendants would become kings of all England and rulers of Britain. That had now happened, and Aethelstan had come to this place to say thank you and to ask the saint for his help in the wars that lay ahead.
And then he invaded Scotland, plundering the lands of the Scots and the Picts. A Northumbrian chronicle says they attacked Dunfod, Dunnottar Castle on the coast south of Aberdeen. In early August, they reached the shores of the Moray Firth, and the fleet went on to Caithness, the northernmost point of the British mainland. There'd been nothing like it since the expedition of the Roman general Agricola. Faced by such a show of force, Constantine submitted to Aethelstan and came back with him into England. But across the British Isles, voices of opposition were growing. In Wales, a poet now called for the King of Kings to be overthrown, and for the English to be driven out of Britain, where they had come as landless wanderers 400 years before.
It is a prophetic poem in which it is hoped that there would be an alliance between the peoples of what I suppose we would term the fringes of the Isles of Britain to push the Athlin, the English, out of England. The idea is that this alliance of Britons, Vikings and the Irish will push them out again and make them once more roamers of the high seas. Asamod Cymru a gwir dilyn, gwyddyr Iwerddon wan Affredin. Chorli wachel dwys I clwys genyn at horion fyd wrthion pan diorfyn.
The muse foretells the men of Wessex will see England burn. When the great battle comes, their dead will be packed, too tight to fall. And in summer 937, the moment came. That August, a huge Viking fleet left Dublin under King Anlaf Guthfrithson, whose kinsman Aethelstan had driven from York 10 years before. The Scots and Strathclyde Welsh came overland under King Constantine. Northumbrian sources say the Viking fleet of 615 ships landed in the Humber. There, in their chief city of York, the Northumbrians joined the invaders. Suddenly, Aethelstan's northern empire had collapsed. The axis of the war was probably the Great North Road. The Allies now began to devastate the lands to the south, to draw Aethelstan to them.
That autumn you have to imagine columns of refugees fleeing away from the smoke as the Allies, the Scots and the North Irish devastated the lands south of the Humber.
They ravaged everything with incessant plundering raids, driving out the peasants and setting fire to their fields. Such was the barbarians' mounted strength. As autumn turned towards winter, Aethelstan still didn't move. And now the moneyers in Nottingham and York stopped putting the king's name on their coins, uncertain how events would turn out. And in England, voices were raised against the king. In his youth he was fearless and bold, it was said, but he now let precious time slip by in inaction, while they destroyed everything. But still, Aethelstan refused to be drawn. A later legend says that he came back to the little chapel of St. Catherine at Milton to pray for God's help.
And as for what Aethelstan might have spoken on this spot at that moment, well, a prayer survives, attributed to him, a prayer before battle in which he asked God to let him fight well and act manfully. And he begs that his enemies will be destroyed like Pharaoh's army before the people of Israel. And at the end of the prayer were a series of dreadful maledictions against the hostile king and his kingdom. Tear them apart, O Lord. Smash them into dust. Aggression, anger, sense of betrayal. Whoever composed that prayer sounds as if he was contemplating a fight to the death.
Alone in his private chapel, he prayed on his most sacred relic, a fragment of the true cross set in a rock crystal. Meditating on his past sins and the sins which would inevitably come with the slaughter of thousands in war. Such were the tensions between being an Anglo-Saxon warrior king and a pious Christian man. There's a later tradition that Aethelstan wore his cross relic around his neck in his battles, literally arming his soul and protecting his body with one of the most potent relics in the whole of Christendom. Then, with the armies of Wessex and Mercia, Aethelstan attacked.
Aethelstan König errichten Berna Bertiva und his brother Berg. Elder Langne Tirje slogan att satse svärda edjum yngve brunnan ur. Nawerth wal mare om fysiklande. Avrevieta folkets je Philip beforan fiso svärdes edjum.
But where Brunanburh was is still a mystery.
We'll never know for sure what happened in 937. But my guess is that it was on this stretch of this road that the Great War of the 10th century came to its climax.
News spread across the northern world. The battle was immense, lamentable and horrible, they said in Ulster. It was a black day for the Scots, they said, more savage than anything on record. He smashed those fierce kings, wrote a Frankish poet, and by God's will trod on their proud necks. There were those who'd criticised his war leadership, but as one of his courtiers wrote long afterwards, he was experienced and far-sighted and very hard to overcome in any conflict. And so it had proved. And even 50 years on, the English still called it the Great War. Aethelstan had saved his crown, but in his books are perhaps hints of the troubling aftermath for him as a Christian.
They contain inscriptions in which Aethelstan A. records that he's the donor of the book, but B. then, yes, asks anybody looking at the inscription to bear him in mind in their prayers.
You who come after me, I ask you for a moment to pray for my soul. In future times, remember me and forgive me my sins. The war had united the West Saxons and Mercians in a great national achievement, though it would be a while yet before the Northumbrians felt part of a new England. As for the Scots and the Welsh, they are still negotiating their relationship with Aethelstan's successors. He'd started as a compromise candidate, a caretaker king. But he had carried through the family plan of his grandfather Alfred, the creation of an English kingdom with governance and justice, law and learning, shires, towns, and workable institutions. He had done as his grandfather asked him. He followed the path of wisdom, and yet, like the old pagan heroes, fought with all his might against the demons. As a man, it was said, he was affable and courteous, and beloved by his people who admired his courage and humility. But he was like a thunderbolt to his enemies by his invincible steadfastness. Aethelstan died in 939, in his mid-40s, maybe worn out by the job. An Irish writer called him the roof tree of the honour of the Western world.
Aethelstan's funeral took place very end of October or early November 939, and he was buried here in Malmesbury, close to his personal saint, Aldhelm. He'd reigned for 14 years only, but he'd set a path for the future, building on what his grandfather and his father and aunt had done. He'd made real the England that Alfred had dreamed. And for all the ups and downs of our history ever since, Aethelstan's visionary kingdom of the English would endure. And of course it still does.
What drove one man to create the largest land empire the world has ever known? The truth about Genghis Khan next on BBC 4, and then the hypnotic power Gaddafi's oil lake had on the rest of the world. Inconceivable cruelty and abuse ignored and